March 1943. The Atlantic Ocean is vast, cold, and deadly. Beneath its dark waves lurk the steel predators of the Kriegsmarine, Germany's U-boats. For months they have prowled the sea lanes, striking with ruthless precision. Allied convoys ferrying vital supplies from North America to Britain move across the ocean in tight formations, escorted by destroyers, corvettes, and armed trawlers. But against the cunning U-boat wolf packs, even the strongest convoy seems vulnerable. That March alone, 108 Allied ships are sent to the bottom. It is the bloodiest month of the Battle of the Atlantic. To many, it looks like Germany might finally choke Britain's lifeline, cutting off the island's food, fuel, and weapons, and bringing Churchill's government to its knees. The German Navy calls it the Second Happy Time. Admiral Karl Dönitz, the architect of the U-boat arm, believes victory is close. At first, the U-boat war had been a sideshow. In 1939 and 1940, Germany's submarine fleet was small, barely 57 operational boats, but it inflicted disproportionate damage. Britain relied on imports to survive, and German commanders knew that sinking merchant tonnage faster than the Allies could replace it might win the war without ever invading the British Isles. In the early years, British defenses were thin. Convoy escorts were scarce, radar and sonar were primitive, and air coverage over the mid-Atlantic was almost non-existent. The U-boats exploited this air gap, submerging by day and surfacing at night to attack under the cover of darkness. The introduction of the Wolfpack tactic, coordinated attacks by groups of submarines, transformed the campaign. Instead of lone submarines acting independently, Dönitz ordered his boats to patrol in lines across expected convoy routes. When one U-boat spotted a convoy, it shadowed it while signaling for reinforcements. Soon, half a dozen or more U-boats would converge, surrounding the merchant ships like wolves circling prey. Then, under the light of the moon or in the pitch darkness of a storm, they struck, firing torpedoes, then slipping away before escorts could react. Entire convoys were sometimes annihilated in a single night. By 1941, the situation for the Allies was desperate. In the first half of that year alone, more than 2 million tons of shipping was sunk. But even as Britain reeled from these losses, the tide was beginning, slowly, to turn. The Royal Navy and Royal Air Force started developing better tools and tactics. The introduction of high-frequency direction finding, known as HFDUF, allowed Allied ships to detect U-boat radio transmissions and estimate their location. Radar technology improved rapidly, especially with the addition of the 10-centimeter wavelength magneton radar, which could spot even a small periscope on the surface at night or in poor weather. The British codebreakers at Bletchley Park also began to make headway against the German Enigma encryption used by the U-boat fleet. Intelligence gained from decoded messages, known as Ultra, gave the Allies insight into U-boat patrol areas and convoy routes. Still, in 1942, Dönitz's submarines seemed unstoppable once again. When the United States entered the war after Pearl Harbor, its Atlantic coastline became a target-rich environment. American coastal defenses were almost non-existent, and merchant ships often sailed with lights blazing, silhouetted against the shore. The U-boats hunted freely from Newfoundland to the Caribbean. Oil tankers burned off Cape Hatteras, and bodies washed up on American beaches. The Germans called it Operation Paukenschlag, the drumbeat. It was another golden era for the U-boat crews, who sent millions of tons of Allied shipping to the bottom. But Germany's success sowed the seeds of its own downfall.
The more U-boats that were built and sent to sea, the more strain was placed on the supply system, the communication network, and the crews themselves. Training standards slipped while Allied technology continued to advance. By late 1942, new escort carriers, small aircraft carriers built on merchant hulls, began to accompany convoys, bringing air cover to the mid-Atlantic for the first time. Long-range patrol aircraft, like the consolidated B-24 Liberator, closed the air gap, forcing U-boats to dive during daylight hours, where they were slower and more vulnerable. March 1943 represented both the high point and the breaking point of the U-boat campaign. In that month's brutal convoy battles, such as Convoy HX-229 and SC-122, more than 20 U-boats attacked two Allied convoys simultaneously. 38 merchant ships were lost, and hundreds of sailors died. For a few days, it looked as though Donitz's wolf packs had regained total control of the Atlantic. British and American leaders feared that the shipping losses would exceed the rate of replacement, the exact scenario Donitz had dreamed of. Yet beneath the surface of this apparent German triumph, the balance of power was shifting in ways invisible to the naked eye. Allied anti-submarine warfare had matured into a deadly science. Escort groups were now trained to work in coordination, using radar, sonar, depth charges, and hedgehog mortars to destroy submarines. Convoy tactics had improved. Instead of passively reacting to attacks, escort commanders went on the offensive, hunting down contacts and forcing the U-boats to stay submerged, where their batteries would drain. Air cover was expanding, and the Allies had developed new tools like the Leigh Light, a powerful searchlight mounted on patrol aircraft that could illuminate U-boats caught on the surface at night. Suddenly, the darkness that had once sheltered the hunters now betrayed them.
In April 1943, the Allies began striking back with devastating effect. The British and Canadians improved coordination between their naval and air commands, ensuring that aircraft could respond rapidly to convoy threats. Ultra-intelligence became even more valuable. Every time Bletchley Park decrypted a new Enigma key, it allowed convoys to be routed away from Wolfpack concentrations. The U-boats, once invisible, were increasingly predictable. Allied scientists were also developing new weapons, improved sonar, ASDIC, faster depth charges, and radar that could detect even a snorkel protruding above the waves. By May 1943, the hunters had become the hunted. That month, later called Black May by the Germans, marked the collapse of the U-boat offensive. 41 U-boats were destroyed in a single month, nearly a quarter of all operational submarines at sea. For the crews, the ocean turned from a hunting ground into a graveyard. The average lifespan of a U-boat crewman dropped to just a few patrols. Donitz was forced to withdraw his remaining boats from the North Atlantic to avoid total annihilation. The transformation had been astonishingly rapid. Only 2 months earlier, Allied morale had been at its lowest point. Now the Atlantic lifeline was secure. The reasons for this reversal were both technological and strategic. First, the Allies had finally achieved overwhelming numbers, not only in ships and planes, but in trained personnel and escorts. The U.S. shipyards were producing Liberty and Victory ships faster than the Germans could sink them, often completing a new freighter in less than 2 weeks. Second, Allied air power extended across nearly the entire ocean, leaving only small pockets where U-boats could surface safely. Third, the intelligence war had decisively turned against Germany. The Allies were reading many of the U-boat signals in real time, while the Germans remained unaware that Enigma had been compromised. At the same time, Germany's U-boat design was stagnating. Most of Donitz's fleet consisted of Type 7 and Type 9 submarines.
excellent designs at the start of the war, but increasingly obsolete by 1943. They were too slow underwater, too noisy, and too dependent on surfacing to recharge their batteries. New models, such as the Type 21 Electroboat, were being developed, sleek, fast, and designed for true underwater endurance, but they would not arrive until it was too late. For the men of the U-boat arm, the shift was devastating. Early in the war, U-boat crews had been regarded as heroes in Germany, celebrated in propaganda films and posters. Their successes were broadcast across the Reich, and their commanders were decorated by Hitler himself. But as losses mounted, morale collapsed. The once proud submarine bases in Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, and Brest became places of mourning. Sailors returning from patrols found empty bunks where their comrades had once slept. The Atlantic, once seen as a battlefield of opportunity, had become a slaughterhouse.
Meanwhile, in Allied headquarters, the sense of relief was immense. Churchill later wrote that the Battle of the Atlantic was the only thing that ever truly frightened him during the war. By mid-1943, that fear was fading. Convoys were crossing the ocean in growing numbers, laden with food, oil, munitions, and American troops. These shipments made possible every major Allied operation that followed, from the invasion of Sicily and Italy to the D-Day landings in Normandy. Without victory in the Atlantic, none of it would have been possible. But even after May 1943, the U-boats did not disappear entirely. Dönitz continued to send out patrols, hoping for a technological breakthrough that would restore his fleet's advantage. The introduction of radar detectors and snorkels allowed submarines to stay submerged longer and avoid some air patrols. A handful of Allied ships were still sunk, and the Atlantic remained a dangerous place. Yet the U-boat threat never regained its former scale. The Allies now dominated the seas, and the U-boat arm, once Germany's sharpest weapon, became a symbol of futility. The strategic consequences of the U-boat defeat were enormous. Germany had invested enormous resources, men, steel, and industry into the submarine fleet. Over 1,100 U-boats were built during the war, but more than 780 were destroyed, with 30,000 submariners killed, a staggering 75% casualty rate, the highest of any branch of the German armed forces. The failure of the U-boat campaign meant that Britain remained in the war, fully supplied and able to serve as a launching base for the liberation of Europe. Looking back, historians have debated the precise moment when the tide turned. Some point to the technological leaps in radar and code-breaking, others to the improved coordination between naval and air forces. Some emphasize the industrial might of the United States, which ensured that no matter how many ships were sunk, more were always on the way. In truth, all these factors converged in early 1943 to form an unbreakable Allied advantage. The U-boats, which once dictated the tempo of the Atlantic War, suddenly found themselves outmatched on every front. Even Dönitz, once supremely confident, recognized the futility. In a message to his crews in May 1943, he admitted the grim reality: the enemy has rendered the U-boat war ineffective in its present form. It was a rare confession of defeat from a man who had built his entire career around the submarine force. After withdrawing his boats from the North Atlantic, Dönitz shifted focus to coastal operations and the defense of European waters, but the age of the wolfpacks was over. For the Allied sailors and airmen who had fought the long, exhausting campaign, victory came at a terrible cost. Tens of thousands of merchant seamen had perished, their ships torpedoed in the cold Atlantic night. Many were civilians, men from Britain, Canada, the United States, Norway, Greece, and dozens of other nations who braved the convoys to keep Britain alive. Their sacrifice ensured that the factories kept running,
The armies kept moving, and the hope of liberation remained alive.
The Battle of the Atlantic lasted nearly 6 years, the longest continuous campaign of the Second World War. It was fought not just with guns and torpedoes, but with mathematics, science, and ingenuity. From the radar labs of Britain to the shipyards of America, from the icy decks of corvettes to the cramped steel coffins of the U-boats, it was a battle of endurance and innovation. When the war finally ended in 1945, the U-boat pens of the French coast stood silent. Many submarines were scuttled by their own crews to prevent capture. Others were surrendered and later destroyed. The survivors who returned to Germany found a nation in ruins. Dönitz himself would briefly become head of state after Hitler's death, presiding over the final collapse of the Third Reich. For him, the defeat in the Atlantic was both personal and symbolic, a reminder that even Germany's most formidable weapon could not overcome the combined strength, resilience, and technological superiority of the Allies. In retrospect, the Battle of the Atlantic reveals a fundamental truth about the Second World War. It was not won by a single weapon or a single victory, but by the relentless accumulation of small advantages. A new radar set here, an extra escort there, a convoy rerouted just in time because of a decrypted message. Each innovation, each decision, each act of bravery at sea added up to a turning point that changed the course of the war. By the end of 1943, Allied shipping losses had fallen to a fraction of their earlier levels, while U-boat sinkings continued to rise. The ocean, once dominated by German submarines, now belonged firmly to the Allies. Supplies flowed freely across the Atlantic, enough to sustain the Allied armies as they advanced toward Germany itself. The men who had fought in the convoy battles often described them as pure endurance, weeks of cold, fear, and exhaustion, broken only by sudden bursts of chaos and fire when torpedoes struck. For those aboard merchant ships, the greatest enemy was not only the U-boat, but the endless tension, knowing that death could come without warning. For U-boat crews, life was even harsher, claustrophobic, damp, and perilous. The smell of diesel and sweat filled the cramped compartments. The sound of depth charges rolling down the sides of the hull was a special kind of terror, each explosion shaking the boat like an earthquake, each one possibly the last. When historians recount the great turning points of the Second World War, Stalingrad, El Alamein, Midway, they often overlook the Atlantic. Yet without victory there, none of those other victories would have mattered. Britain would have starved, the Soviet Union would have received no Lend-Lease aid, and the invasion of Europe would have been impossible. The Battle of the Atlantic was not fought for glory or headlines. It was fought to keep the arteries of the Allied war effort open. The story of how the U-boats went from hunters to hunted in just 2 months is not merely one of technology or luck. It is the story of adaptation, of how the Allies learned from defeat, improved their methods, and turned the tools of science and cooperation into instruments of victory. It is also a story of tragedy for the thousands of young German sailors who went to sea believing they could starve Britain into submission, and who instead found only the cold embrace of the Atlantic depths. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, the U-boat fleet had been shattered. Of more than 860 submarines lost during the war, the majority had gone down in the Atlantic. The ocean floor became their cemetery, an invisible monument to a battle that determined the fate of the modern world. And so the answer to the question, how did the U-boats go from hunters to hunted so quickly, lies in the convergence of courage, intelligence, and relentless innovation. The Allies learned faster, built faster, and adapted faster. The ocean that had once been Germany's greatest weapon became its greatest trap. From March to May 1943, the tide of war turned decisively,
not on the beaches or in the skies, but in the gray, unforgiving waters of the North Atlantic, where victory came not in a single battle, but in the slow, grinding mastery of the sea.